November 1949. The Harlem Precinct house on West 123rd Street stood 4 stories tall, red brick darkened by decades of coal smoke and exhaust fumes. The building occupied a full city block, its windows barred, its entrance flanked by gas lamps that had been converted to electricity but retained their original iron casings. At 9:45 on a Tuesday morning, the street outside was busy with ordinary traffic. Women pushed baby carriages toward the market on Lenox Avenue. Men in work clothes headed to construction sites downtown. A group of school children, their leather satchels bouncing against their backs, walked in a loose formation toward the elementary school on 125th Street. Inside the precinct, the main room smelled of floor wax, tobacco, and the particular odor of too many bodies in too small a space. And wooden benches lined the walls, where people waited to report crimes, file complaints, or inquire about relatives who had been arrested. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set Irishman named Patrick Sullivan, sat elevated on a platform behind a high oak counter. His uniform was pressed, his brass buttons polished, but his eyes carried the weariness of a man who had worked the same desk for 17 years. At the rear of the room, near the stairs leading to the second-floor detective bureau, 3 men stood in quiet conversation. Captain William Morrison, the precinct commander, wore his uniform with military precision. He was 52 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and had run this precinct since 1945. Beside him stood Lieutenant James Donnelly, the head of the vice squad, a thin man with a sharp face and sharper instincts. And the third man was Detective Frank Russo, who specialized in gambling enforcement. They were discussing the previous night's raid on a numbers operation on 132nd Street. 12 arrests, $3,000 in cash seized. A successful operation by any measure. Captain Morrison was satisfied. The newspapers would report it favorably. City Hall would be pleased. The precinct's arrest statistics would improve. At 10 o'clock, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson walked through the front door. He wore a navy blue suit of fine wool, tailored to fit his frame precisely. His shirt was white cotton, starched stiff. His tie was burgundy silk with a subtle pattern. His shoes, black leather Oxfords, reflected the overhead lights. At 44 years old, and he moved with the controlled ease of a man who understood that physical presence mattered as much as words. The bump on the back of his head, the physical peculiarity that had given him his nickname, was hidden beneath a black fedora. Johnson walked directly to the front desk. Sergeant Sullivan looked up, recognized him immediately, and his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Everyone in the precinct knew who Bumpy Johnson was. He controlled Harlem's numbers racket. He collected protection money from businesses throughout the neighborhood. He employed perhaps 200 people in various illegal enterprises, and he did all of this with the quiet efficiency of a businessman running a legitimate corporation. "I need to speak with Captain Morrison," Johnson said. His voice was calm, unhurried. "The captain is busy," Sullivan replied. I'll wait." Johnson turned and walked to one of the wooden benches. He sat down, removed his hat, and placed it on his lap. Then he simply waited, his hands folded, his expression neutral. Sullivan watched him for a moment, then picked up the telephone on his desk and made a brief call. 2 minutes later, Lieutenant Donnelly appeared from the back of the room. He approached Johnson with the careful posture of a man approaching something unpredictable. "Mr. Johnson," Donnelly said. "What can we do for you?" "I need to speak with Captain Morrison," Johnson repeated. "The captain is in a meeting. Perhaps I can help you with whatever—" "It needs to be the captain." Donnelly's jaw tightened. "Mr. Johnson, if you have a complaint to file, you can speak with Sergeant Sullivan. If you have information about a crime, you can speak with me." "But the captain doesn't take walk-in meetings." Johnson looked at Donnelly with the same neutral expression he had worn since entering the building. "Tell the captain," he said quietly, "that I'm here about last night's raid on 132nd Street. Tell him I have information he needs to hear, and tell him that if he doesn't want to hear it now, he's going to wish he had." It was not a threat. The tone carried no aggression, but the certainty in Johnson's voice made it clear that this was not a negotiation about whether a meeting would happen, only about when. Donnelly stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the stairs. Johnson remained seated. Around him, the normal business of the precinct continued. People filed complaints. Officers came and went. No one looked directly at Johnson, but everyone was aware of his presence. 15 minutes passed. Then Captain Morrison himself appeared at the top of the stairs. He descended slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the wooden steps. When he reached the main floor, he walked directly to Johnson. "My office," Morrison said. "Now." Johnson stood, replaced his hat, and followed Morrison through a side door, down a narrow corridor, and into a small office. The room contained a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a window that looked out onto an alley. Morrison closed the door and moved behind his desk, but did not sit down. "You've got 5 minutes," Morrison said. "What's this about?" Johnson remained standing as well. "Last night you arrested 12 men from the numbers operation on 132nd Street. But those men work for me. They were running an illegal gambling operation. They were. And now they're sitting in your cells downstairs waiting to be processed. Some of them will make bail, some won't. All of them will have their names in the newspapers. Their families will be embarrassed. Their employers, their legitimate employers, the day jobs they hold to supplement their income, will fire them. And for what? So you can show City Hall that you're tough on crime?" Morrison's face reddened slightly. "Watch your tone, Johnson. You don't walk into my precinct and lecture me about law enforcement." "I'm not lecturing you," Johnson said, his voice still calm. "I'm explaining a problem that we both have and suggesting a solution that benefits both of us. We don't have any problems together. You have problems. You run illegal operations, and it's my job to shut them down." Johnson was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was even softer than before. "Captain, let me ask you something. How long have you been running this precinct?" 4 years. "And in those 4 years, how many major crimes have you had to deal with? Murders, robberies, assaults?" Morrison's expression shifted slightly. "What's your point?" "My point is that Harlem is relatively peaceful. It's not the South Bronx. It's not Hell's Kitchen. Crime happens, yes, but not the kind of crime that makes headlines. Not the kind that gets captains removed from their positions. And you want to know why that is? Enlighten me." "Because I keep it that way," Johnson said. "I run the numbers, I collect protection money, but I also maintain order. When outside gangs try to move into Harlem, I move them out. When someone tries to start trouble in the neighborhood, I stop it before it becomes your problem. You get to run a relatively quiet precinct, and the people of Harlem get to live without fear of random violence. That's the arrangement we've had, whether we've ever discussed it or not." Morrison stared at him. "So what do you want? You want me to let your people go?" "No," Johnson said. "I want you to understand that we're going to change how things work. Last night's raid was loud. It was public. It was designed to make a statement. But all it accomplished was disrupting an operation that employs dozens of people and generates income for families who have no other options. Those 12 men you arrested? They're not criminals in the way you understand criminals. They're working people trying to survive in a city that offers them very few legitimate opportunities. The law doesn't care about their circumstances. The law, Johnson said, is whatever we decide it is in practice. You enforce it selectively every single day. Every cop in this building does. You let some things go. You pursue others. You make choices based on what serves your interests and the city's interests. I'm simply suggesting that we formalize those choices in a way that serves both our interests." Morrison walked around his desk and sat down heavily in his chair. "You're suggesting corruption." "I'm suggesting practicality," Johnson corrected. "You need arrests. You need statistics. You need to show your superiors that you're doing your job. I understand that. But you don't need to destroy people's lives to get those numbers. There's a better way." "What way?" "I'll provide you with people to arrest. People who work for me who understand that arrest is part of the cost of doing business in this line of work. You'll get your numbers. The newspapers will report your successes. City Hall will be happy. And in return, you'll conduct those arrests in a way that minimizes the damage to the people involved and to the operations they work for." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You're asking me to stage arrests. I'm asking you to exercise the same discretion you already exercise every day, but with more coordination. You arrest people all the time. I'm just asking that when you need those arrests, you come to me first. I'll tell you who can afford to be arrested at any given time. Oh, who has the bail money ready? Who won't lose their day job because of it? Who understands that this is just business?" The captain was silent for a long moment, studying Johnson's face. "And what do you get out of this?" "Predictability," Johnson said. "Right now, your raids are random. You hit operations when you need headlines or when City Hall puts pressure on you. That creates chaos. It disrupts business unnecessarily. But if we coordinate, you still get your arrests, and I get to manage the disruption. Nobody loses their livelihood. Nobody goes to jail for longer than necessary. The system keeps running smoothly." "This is insane." "This is practical," Johnson repeated. "You've been taking money from my organization for years. Every cop in this precinct has. Don't pretend otherwise. I'm simply suggesting that instead of taking money and still conducting random raids, we formalize the relationship. You get what you need. I get what I need. And the people of Harlem get a police force that's predictable and manageable instead of randomly destructive." Morrison stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the alley. His hands were clasped behind his back. For nearly a minute he said nothing, then he turned around. "Get out of my office," he said quietly. Johnson did not move. "Captain, get out. Now. Before I have you arrested for attempting to bribe a police officer." Johnson studied Morrison's face, then nodded once. He turned, walked to the door, opened it, and left without another word. He walked back through the corridor, through the main room of the precinct, and out onto the street. The morning was growing warmer. The sun had burned through the early cloud cover. He walked north on Lenox Avenue, his pace steady, his expression unchanged. Behind him, in the precinct house, Captain Morrison returned to his desk and sat down. He stared at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up the telephone and made 3 calls. The first was to the deputy inspector who oversaw all Harlem precincts. The second was to the district attorney's office. The third was to the police commissioner's office. Within the hour, word had spread through the department that Bumpy Johnson had walked into the 123rd Street precinct and attempted to bribe the captain. Morrison was praised for his integrity. A memo was circulated reminding all officers of the department's zero-tolerance policy toward corruption. Johnson learned about the memo by that evening. He received a copy of it, delivered to him by a patrol officer who had been on his payroll for 6 years. The officer looked embarrassed when he handed it over, but Johnson simply thanked him and sent him away. For 3 days, Johnson did nothing. He ran his operations as he always had. He collected money, he paid his people, he attended to the 1,000 small details that kept an illegal enterprise functioning, but he also watched, and he listened, and he thought. The problem was not Captain Morrison personally. Morrison was simply a representative of a system. The New York Police Department operated on the assumption that it held all the power in any interaction with criminals. Police officers made arrests when they wanted, where they wanted, and how they wanted. Criminals responded by trying to evade arrest, by bribing officers, by creating chaos that forced the police to waste resources. But this system created inefficiency for everyone involved. The police spent enormous amounts of time and money conducting raids that yielded minimal results. Criminals spent enormous amounts of time and money evading police attention. And the communities where both operated suffered the most, caught between law enforcement that was often brutal and unpredictable, and criminal enterprises that were equally chaotic. Johnson understood that changing this system required more than convincing one captain. It required building a coalition that could apply pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. It required making the current system more painful to maintain than a new system would be to implement. On the 4th day after his meeting with Morrison, Johnson began making calls. The first call was to Reverend Marcus Thompson, pastor of the Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church on 132nd Street. Reverend Thompson was 61 years old, had led his congregation for 23 years, and commanded enormous respect in the community. He was also pragmatic. He understood that Harlem existed in a complicated moral space where people did what they needed to do to survive. Johnson met with Thompson in the pastor's study, a small room filled with books and the smell of pipe tobacco. He explained the situation simply. Police raids were disrupting families, costing people their jobs, and creating instability in the community. And he asked Thompson to use his influence with community leaders and elected officials to advocate for more measured law enforcement approaches. Thompson listened carefully. When Johnson finished, the pastor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're asking me to protect criminals." "I'm asking you to protect families," Johnson replied. "Most of the people who work in the numbers business aren't criminals in any meaningful sense. They're people trying to feed their children in a city that won't hire them for legitimate work. When police conduct these raids, they're not stopping crime. They're just punishing poverty." Thompson considered this. "What exactly do you want me to do?" "Form a citizens committee. Community leaders, church people, business owners. Have them meet with the precinct captain and the borough commander. Express concern about aggressive policing tactics. Ask for more community input into law enforcement priorities. Make it clear that the community doesn't want less policing, just smarter policing." "And this benefits you how?" "It creates political pressure," Johnson said. "Right now, the police answer only to City Hall. But if the community starts demanding accountability, that changes the calculation. It makes coordination more attractive than confrontation." Thompson agreed to consider it. Within a week, he had organized a committee of 15 community leaders. They requested a meeting with Captain Morrison. The second call Johnson made was to Samuel Goldman, who owned a chain of grocery stores throughout Harlem and the Bronx. Goldman was a businessman who understood that stable neighborhoods were good for business, and he also understood that the numbers racket employed hundreds of people who then spent their money in local businesses. Johnson explained that aggressive police raids were destabilizing the neighborhood's economic ecosystem. He suggested that Goldman organize other business owners to meet with city officials and express concern about policing strategies that were disrupting commerce. Goldman understood immediately. Within 2 weeks, the Harlem Merchants Association had drafted a letter to the mayor's office, signed by 62 business owners, expressing concern about police tactics that were creating economic instability and reducing consumer confidence in our business district. The third call was to Margaret Reynolds, a civil rights attorney who had successfully sued the police department twice for excessive force and unlawful search. Reynolds was 38 years old, brilliant, and deeply committed to protecting black communities from police abuse. Johnson met with Reynolds in her office on 135th Street. He explained that police raids in Harlem were often conducted without proper warrants, that property was seized without due process, and that people were being arrested on flimsy pretexts. He suggested that she begin documenting these violations and preparing a class action lawsuit against the department. Reynolds asked the obvious question: why would a numbers runner care about proper police procedure? Johnson's answer was simple. Because improper procedure hurts everyone. Yes, I run illegal operations, but that doesn't mean the police should be allowed to violate constitutional rights. If they can do it to us, they can do it to anyone. And eventually—
They will,"
Reynolds agreed. She began collecting affidavits from people who had been arrested in police raids. She documented instances of illegal searches, excessive force, and constitutional violations. She prepared a lawsuit demanding an injunction against the police department's current raiding practices. The fourth call was to Officer Thomas Brennan, a 15-year veteran of the precinct who had been taking money from Johnson's organization for a decade. Brennan was not a high-ranking officer, but he was well-liked among his colleagues and had the ear of several senior detectives. Johnson asked Brennan to begin quietly circulating a message among the rank-and-file officers. The current approach to gambling enforcement was creating unnecessary work and unnecessary risk for patrol officers. Raids required extensive planning and involved potential violence and generated massive amounts of paperwork, all for arrests that rarely led to serious prosecutions. Johnson suggested an alternative message. What if there was a way to get the same arrest numbers with less work, less risk, and less community hostility? Brennan, who like most cops preferred easy work to hard work, readily agreed to spread this message. Over the next month, pressure built from 4 different directions. The Community Leaders Committee met with Captain Morrison and the borough commander. They presented a petition signed by 847 Harlem residents expressing concern about aggressive policing. They cited specific instances of families disrupted by arrests, children traumatized by witnessing their parents being taken away, and businesses damaged by police raids. And they asked for a more measured approach, one that prioritized serious crimes over gambling offenses that harmed no one. The Harlem Merchants Association's letter reached the mayor's office, where it was taken seriously because business owners represented votes and tax revenue. An assistant to the mayor called the police commissioner to ask why Harlem merchants were complaining about police tactics. Margaret Reynolds filed her class action lawsuit in federal court. The New York Times ran a story about it under the headline, "Harlem Attorney Challenges Police Raid Procedures." The story detailed numerous instances of questionable police conduct during gambling raids. The police department's legal office immediately recognized that defending against this lawsuit would be expensive, time-consuming, and might result in court-ordered restrictions on how raids could be conducted. And among the rank-and-file officers, a quiet conversation began. Why were they spending so much time and effort on gambling raids that everyone knew wouldn't stop gambling? Why risk their safety rating numbers operations when they could be focusing on real crimes? Several officers began asking their supervisors these questions. The supervisors, in turn, began asking their commanders. By December 1949, 6 weeks after Johnson's initial meeting with Morrison, the captain was receiving pressure from multiple sources. His superiors wanted to know why community leaders were complaining. The police commissioner's office wanted to know why the department was being sued, and his own officers were quietly expressing frustration with current enforcement priorities. Morrison was smart enough to recognize what was happening. This was not coincidence. This was coordination. And there was only one person in Harlem capable of coordinating pressure from this many different directions. On a Friday afternoon in mid-December, Morrison made a phone call. He called the number for a social club on 125th Street, a known front for Johnson's operations. He left a message. "Tell Mr. Johnson that Captain Morrison would like to meet with him. Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock, at the location of his choice." The message reached Johnson within an hour. He sent back word. "The Green Parrot Cafe, 127th and 7th Avenue, 2 o'clock. The Green Parrot was a restaurant that served the Harlem middle class, a place where professionals and business owners met for lunch. It was neutral territory, public enough to prevent violence, private enough to allow serious conversation. Morrison arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. He wore civilian clothes, a dark suit, and a hat pulled low. He entered the restaurant and found Johnson sitting in a booth near the back. Morrison slid into the seat across from him. "You've made your point," Morrison said without preamble. Johnson sipped his coffee. "What point is that?" "Don't play games. You organized all of this. The community committee, the merchants, the lawsuit, the whisper campaign among my officers. You created pressure from every possible direction to force me to this table." "I simply made people aware of problems that already existed," Johnson said. "The community genuinely is concerned about aggressive policing. The merchants genuinely are worried about economic stability. The attorney genuinely believes the department is violating constitutional rights. I didn't create those concerns. I just helped people express them." Morrison leaned back in the booth. "What do you want?" "The same thing I wanted 6 weeks ago. Coordination instead of chaos. You need arrests. I need predictability. We can both have what we want if we're willing to work together. You want me to let you control when and how arrests happen? I want us to coordinate so that arrests accomplish their purpose without causing unnecessary damage. You want statistics. I'll give you statistics, but we do it in a way that's manageable for everyone involved." Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Walk me through how this would work." Johnson set down his coffee cup. "Once a month, you let me know how many arrests you need for your reports. Gambling arrests specifically. I designate people from my organization who are willing to be arrested that month. We coordinate the time and place. You conduct the raid, make the arrests, and process people exactly as you normally would. The district attorney prosecutes, people plead guilty to minor charges, pay fines, and go home. Your statistics are maintained, City Hall is satisfied, and the community isn't disrupted by random raids that destroy lives unnecessarily. What about property seizures, cash, equipment, betting slips? We provide prop materials. Enough to make the arrests look legitimate, but not enough to actually damage our operations. You seize what you need for evidence. Oh, we factor that into our operating costs. And the people being arrested? They're actually willing to go through this? They work for me, Johnson said. Part of working in this business is understanding that arrest is a risk. If I can minimize that risk, manage when it happens, and ensure people don't lose their livelihoods because of it, then yes, people will accept it as part of the job. I'll cover their legal fees. I'll make sure they have bail money. I'll guarantee their day jobs aren't affected because the arrests will happen at times that don't conflict with legitimate employment. Morrison stared at him. This is insane. This is efficient, Johnson corrected. Right now, you spend enormous resources on raids that accomplish very little. Officers waste time. We waste time. The courts get clogged with cases that don't matter. Well, nobody wins. But if we coordinate, you get what you need with minimal effort. I get what I need with minimal disruption, and the community gets a police department that focuses on crimes that actually matter. And what about actual crime? Violent crime? That's where this benefits you most, Johnson said. If your officers aren't wasting time on gambling raids, they can focus on real crimes, robberies, assaults, murders, the things that actually make neighborhoods unsafe. And I'll help with that. I have information networks throughout Harlem. When I hear about serious crimes being planned, I'll pass that information to you. You get to solve cases before they happen. Morrison rubbed his face with both hands. He looked tired. "If anyone finds out about this—" "No one will find out," Johnson said. "Because from the outside, everything will look exactly like it always has. You'll conduct raids. You'll make arrests. You'll process people through the system. The only difference is that the chaos becomes predictable. The randomness becomes managed, and everyone benefits." The captain was quiet for a very long time. Finally, he said, "I need to think about this." "Take your time," Johnson said. "But while you're thinking, consider this. The pressure I created over the past 6 weeks doesn't go away just because we're having this conversation. The community committee is still active. The merchants are still concerned. The lawsuit is still pending. And your officers are still asking questions about priorities. You can work with me and make all of that go away, or you can refuse and watch the pressure continue to build. Your choice." Morrison stood up. He looked down at Johnson for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked out of the restaurant. For 3 days, Johnson heard nothing. He continued running his operations normally, but he also kept the pressure active. The community committee held another meeting with the borough commander. The Merchants Association sent a follow-up letter to the mayor's office. Margaret Reynolds filed additional affidavits in her lawsuit, and Officer Brennan continued circulating his message among the patrol officers. On the 4th day, Johnson received a message. Captain Morrison wanted to meet again. Same location, same time. This time, when Morrison arrived at the Green Parrot, he brought a notebook. He sat down across from Johnson and opened it to a blank page. "If we do this," Morrison said, "we do it with clear rules. I need to know exactly how it works. No surprises, no deviations." Johnson nodded. "Of course." They spent the next 2 hours working through the details. Morrison would provide Johnson with monthly arrest quotas based on what the department needed for statistical reporting. Johnson would designate specific individuals from his organization to be arrested. These individuals would be provided with full legal representation, bail money, and job protection. The arrests would occur at predetermined times and locations. Property seizures would be limited to amounts that appeared legitimate but didn't significantly damage operations. In exchange, Johnson would provide information about serious crimes occurring in Harlem, helping Morrison's Detective Bureau increase its clearance rate for violent offenses. There was also an understanding, unspoken but clear, that the existing financial arrangements would continue. Police officers would still receive their regular payments from Johnson's organization. This new coordination was an addition to those arrangements, not a replacement. By the end of the meeting, they had a framework. Morrison said he needed to discuss it with 2 senior lieutenants who could be trusted. Johnson said he needed to discuss it with his senior organizers who would be responsible for implementation. 1 week later, they met for a 3rd time. Both men confirmed that their respective organizations were ready to proceed. They agreed to begin with a test run in January 1950. On January 12, 1950, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the New York Police Department conducted a raid on a numbers operation at a social club on 128th Street. 7 men were arrested. Cash and betting slips were seized. The local newspapers reported it as another successful police action against illegal gambling. What the newspapers didn't report was that all 7 men had volunteered to be arrested. They had been told the exact time the raid would occur. They had made arrangements with their day jobs to take time off. They had bail money waiting. They had attorneys ready to represent them. And the cash and betting slips that were seized had been specifically set aside for this purpose. The 7 men were processed through the system exactly as they would have been in any other arrest. They were booked, fingerprinted, and held until bail was posted. They appeared in court, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor gambling charges, paid fines, and were released. The entire process took 48 hours, and from the police department's perspective, it was a clean, successful operation. They got their arrests, their statistics, and their newspaper coverage. From Johnson's perspective, it was a managed disruption. 7 people who understood the cost of doing business had temporarily inconvenienced themselves for the good of the organization, and in return, they received full support throughout the process. More importantly, no other raids occurred in Harlem that month. The random, chaotic enforcement that had characterized police action for years suddenly became predictable. Operations that had been disrupted by surprise raids could now plan around scheduled arrests. In February, the arrangement continued. Morrison provided Johnson with another quota, 9 arrests. Johnson designated 9 people. The raid occurred on schedule. The arrests were processed. The system functioned smoothly. By March, the arrangement had become routine, and as it became routine, the benefits became clear to everyone involved. For the police department, gambling enforcement became dramatically more efficient. Officers spent less time planning complicated raids. They faced less community resistance because raids were smaller and less frequent. Their arrest statistics remained strong, which pleased the higher-ups. And their clearance rate for violent crimes improved because they were receiving regular intelligence from Johnson about serious criminal activity. For Johnson's organization, operations stabilized. The constant threat of random raids diminished. People who worked in the numbers business understood that arrest was still a possibility, but it was a managed possibility. And they knew they would be supported through the process. They knew they wouldn't lose their livelihoods, and that certainty allowed the business to run more efficiently. For the community, the change was equally significant. Police raids, which had often involved aggressive tactics and collateral damage to innocent bystanders, became smaller and more focused. Families weren't traumatized by watching their fathers or brothers dragged away unexpectedly. Businesses weren't disrupted by chaotic police actions. The neighborhood became more stable, and the community committee, the Merchants Association, and the pending lawsuit all quietly faded away. The pressure that Johnson had created evaporated because it was no longer needed. Captain Morrison could truthfully tell his superiors that he had addressed community concerns and improved department efficiency. By summer of 1950, the arrangement had been functioning smoothly for 6 months. Morrison and Johnson met monthly to coordinate quotas and discuss intelligence sharing. The relationship was professional, businesslike, and mutually beneficial. Other precinct captains in Harlem began to notice that the 123rd Street precinct seemed to run more smoothly than their own. Morrison's statistics were strong. His community relations were good. His officers seemed satisfied. When these captains asked Morrison about his methods, he was deliberately vague. "Better coordination with community leaders," he would say. "More strategic enforcement priorities." Some of these captains reached out to Johnson through intermediaries. but asking if similar arrangements might be possible in their precincts. Johnson considered each request carefully. He understood that expanding the system carried risks, but it also carried benefits. Over the next year, he established similar arrangements with 3 other precinct captains in Harlem. The system was never formalized in writing. There were no contracts, no official agreements, no paper trail that could expose the arrangement. It existed purely as an understanding between pragmatic men who recognized that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. And it worked. For nearly a decade, from 1950 until Johnson's imprisonment on federal drug charges in 1952, the system functioned with remarkable efficiency. Police made arrests. Johnson's organization continued operating. The community remained stable. Everyone benefited. When Johnson was sentenced to 15 years and sent to Alcatraz, the arrangements he had established continued in his absence. His lieutenants maintained the coordination with police captains. The monthly quotas were met. The intelligence sharing continued. The system had become self-sustaining. By the time Johnson was released in 1963, the landscape had changed significantly. Federal law enforcement had become more aggressive about organized crime. The civil rights movement had changed how black communities viewed cooperation with police. And a new generation of criminals had different ideas about how to operate. But the legacy of what Johnson had created remained. The idea that law enforcement and criminal organizations could coordinate for mutual benefit, that chaos could be replaced with predictable systems, and that everyone could win if they were willing to negotiate, these ideas persisted. The system Johnson created was never exposed during his lifetime. No newspaper ever reported on it. No prosecutor ever investigated it. It remained one of Harlem's many quiet secrets, known to those who participated but invisible to everyone else. When Johnson died in 1968, he left behind many legacies: his reputation as a protector of Harlem, his business acumen, his ability to negotiate with powerful people on equal terms. But perhaps his most significant legacy was this: he proved that power came not from forcing confrontation, but from creating systems where everyone's interests aligned. Captain Morrison retired from the police department in 1957 with a full pension and a reputation as an effective, community-minded commander. Yet he never spoke publicly about his arrangement with Johnson. He took that secret to his grave in 1974. The community leaders who had formed the committee in 1949 went on to play significant roles in Harlem's civil rights movement in the 1960s. They learned from their experience that organized pressure could change systems. They applied those lessons to fighting for voting rights, housing equality, and educational opportunities. The police officers who had participated in the arranged raids, who had seen firsthand that coordination could be more effective than confrontation, carried those lessons through their careers. Some of them became captains and commanders themselves. They understood that power sharing, when done carefully, could produce better outcomes than power hoarding. And the people of Harlem, who had lived through the transition from chaotic policing to managed enforcement, understood something fundamental about power. It could be negotiated. Systems that appeared fixed could be changed, and change didn't require violence or revolution. Sometimes it just required the patience to build coalitions, apply pressure from multiple directions, and wait for those in power to recognize that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. This was not a heroic story in any conventional sense. There were no dramatic confrontations, no moments of triumph, no celebrations. It was simply the story of a man who understood systems, who recognized that power came from managing complexity rather than creating chaos, and who had the patience to build something that would outlast him. When historians later studied organized crime in Harlem, and they focused on the violence, the drama, the colorful personalities, they missed the more significant story, the quiet revolution in how power was exercised, the transformation of random enforcement into coordinated management, the proof that even in an illegal enterprise, professionalism and strategy mattered more than force. Bumpy Johnson allowed the police to make arrests on his terms, and in doing so, he changed what those terms meant. He transformed arrest from an expression of police power into a negotiated transaction. He turned chaos into system. He replaced dominance with coordination. And that transformation, invisible to most, changed everything about how power operated in Harlem for a generation.